you're holding something in Philadelphia that shouldn't exist, at least not in the way it does. Comment below where you're listening from and what time it is, because what we're about to explore together spans continents and millennia, connecting texts that were never supposed to speak to one another. The climate-controlled vault at the University of Pennsylvania Museum smells like old clay and preservation chemicals. The catalogue number reads CBS 1673. The dimensions are precise: 13.3 centimetres long, 10.16 centimetres wide, 1.9 centimetres thick, baked clay, brownish red, the colour of ancient riverbanks. The weight in your palm would be substantial, heavier than you'd expect for something so small, dense with the compressed sediment of the Euphrates region. This tablet was excavated at Nippur in 1896, part of the Babylonian expedition funded by a gift from the Sultan. It dates to approximately 1650 BCE, the Old Babylonian period. Only the lower third survives. 6 columns of text, 3 on each side, written in Sumerian cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script pressed into wet clay by scribes over 36 centuries ago. Each of the preserved columns contains 10 to 15 lines. If the complete tablet had survived, scholars estimate it would have held approximately 260 lines. The text deals with the creation of humans, the cities that existed before a catastrophic flood, the rulers of those cities, and divine instructions about what would come after. But here's what catches in the throat when you read the translation. This tablet lists the names of beings who appear in texts separated by thousands of miles and hundreds of years. Names that emerge in documents written in completely different languages, describing events that mainstream scholarship insists are unrelated mythologies. The tablet speaks of the Anunnaki. It speaks of divine beings descending, of decisions made about humanity, of a flood sent to destroy what had become corrupted. And if you place this text beside others, tablets from Qumran caves, manuscripts copied by Hebrew scribes, Akkadian epics recovered from Assyrian libraries, a pattern begins to form. Not proof, not certainty, but a pattern that asks uncomfortable questions about what we think we know. What if these weren't separate stories? What if the Anunnaki documented in Sumerian tablets and the beings called Nephilim in Hebrew texts were the same entities, recorded from different cultural perspectives? Not aliens, not fantasy, but preserved memories of something that happened before recorded history as we define it. Something so significant that multiple civilizations felt compelled to write it down, each in their own language, each with their own understanding. The tablet CBS 1673 sits in its climate-controlled case, fragmentary and silent. But the questions it raises refuse to stay contained. The cities before the waters rose. Before the flood, according to CBS 1673, there were cities. Not primitive settlements, but organised urban centres, with names, divine protectors and rulers, whose reigns are recorded with precision that seems impossible. The tablet preserves 5 city names. Eridu, assigned to the protection of Ea, known in Sumerian as Enki, god of water and wisdom. The text describes this as a port town, which makes sense. Eridu sat at the edge of the marshlands where the Euphrates met the Persian Gulf, a place where fresh water and salt water mingled, where civilization met the unknown depths. Then Larak, then Sippar, then Shuruppak, each city placed under the care of specific deities, each with rulers whose names and reign lengths the scribes carefully preserve. The Weld-Blundell prism offers more detail. This 4-sided clay object, catalogue number WB444, was discovered at Lhasa in 1922 by archaeologist Herbert Weld-Blundell. It resides now in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. 20 centimetres tall, 9 centimetres wide on each face, covered in tightly packed cuneiform script. It's called a king list, a chronological record of every ruler of Sumer from the beginning of kingship until approximately 1800 BCE. But the beginning of that list is where things become strange. After the kingship descended from heaven, the text begins, the kingship was in Eridu. Then it names the first king, Alulim, who ruled for 28,800 years. The second king, Alaljar, ruled for 36,000 years. In the city of Larak, Ensipat-Zidana ruled for 28,800 years. In Sippar, Enmen-Jorana ruled for 21,000 years. In Shuruppak, Ubartutu, who the text identifies as the father of the flood hero Ziusudra, ruled for 18,600 years. 8 kings, 5 cities, combined reign 241,200 years, according to the Sumerian calculation. Then the text states plainly, the flood swept over. Mainstream scholarship explains these numbers as symbolic, theological, or simply mythological exaggeration. The rains couldn't be literal. Humans don't live for 28,000 years. The numbers must mean something else. Cyclical time, dynastic successions compressed into single reigns, or numerical systems we don't fully understand. These are reasonable interpretations. They allow us to preserve the historical kernel while dismissing the impossible elements. But what's worth noting is what happens after the flood in the same text. The king list continues, the cities are rebuilt, new dynasties emerge, and suddenly the reign lengths change dramatically. The first king of the first dynasty of Kish, post-flood, ruled for 1,200 years, still impossibly long by modern understanding, but a fraction of the antediluvian reigns. The second king ruled for 960 years. The pattern continues downward. By the time you reach the kings, for whom we have archaeological confirmation, rulers whose palaces have been excavated, whose inscriptions match other historical sources, the reign lengths match normal human lifespans. 20 years, 35 years, 11 years. Something changed between the pre-flood period and the post-flood period in the Sumerian historical consciousness. The scribes who compiled these lists weren't stupid. They knew the difference between 30 years and 30,000 years. Yet they recorded both with the same careful precision, using the same formulaic language, maintaining the same documentary tone. The Eridu Genesis, the text preserved on CBS 1673, adds another layer. After describing the creation of humans and the establishment of cities, it mentions specific divine instructions. The cities aren't random settlements. They're deliberately founded, placed under divine protection, given specific functions. Eridu belongs to Enki. The text describes how kingship itself descended from heaven. It wasn't developed by humans. It was given to them, a structured system of governance arriving fully formed. This presents a philosophical problem that runs throughout Mesopotamian literature. The Sumerians don't describe themselves as inventors of civilization. They describe themselves as recipients of civilization. The knowledge came from somewhere else, from someone else. The cities, the kingship, the technologies, the agricultural systems, the legal codes, all of this is framed as inheritance, not innovation. And then the flood, not as natural disaster, but as decision. The gods, specifically the Anunnaki, whose role we'll examine closely, determine that humanity has become problematic. The text doesn't fully explain why in the preserved sections. We have fragments, implications, edges of a larger narrative mostly lost. But the decision is made. Send water, erase what exists, start again with a remnant. Ziusudra receives warning. Like Noah in the Hebrew text, like Utnapishtim in the Gilgamesh epic, like Atrahasis in the Akkadian version, he's chosen to survive. He builds a boat. The storm comes, 7 days and 7 nights, according to CBS 106.73. The sun returns. Ziusudra emerges and offers sacrifices. The gods, after their fury is mollified, grant him eternal life and place him in Dilmun, a paradisiacal land to the east. The cities that existed before the flood are described as real places. Archaeological excavation confirms that Eridu, Sippar and Shuruppak were actual urban centres, among the oldest in Mesopotamia. Eridu's temples date back to approximately 5400 BCE. These weren't imaginary locations inserted into mythology, they were real cities with real occupation layers, real temples, real administrative buildings. So what were the Sumerian scribes recording? Pure fiction set in real places? Cultural memory that compressed centuries of development into single narrative? Or something else? Preserved accounts of a world that functioned differently, ruled by kings who lived impossibly long lives in cities guided by beings the texts call gods. The pattern is this: before the flood, extended reigns, divine presence, established civilization. After the flood, shorter reigns, increasing distance from the divine, and what reads like gradual recovery of knowledge that had been lost, as if something was being rebuilt rather than built for the first time. The tablet sits in Philadelphia with this story pressed into its surface. The cities are named, the kings are listed, the flood is documented, and the beings who made the decision, the Anunnaki, are mentioned repeatedly, their council convening, their judgment rendered, their actions shaping the entire narrative. Who were they? The Anunnaki Council. The word Anunnaki appears across 2,000 years of Mesopotamian texts, but its meaning shifts depending on when and where you're reading. The University of Pennsylvania's ORAC database, the online richly annotated cuneiform corpus, provides the most comprehensive scholarly treatment currently available. What emerges from the academic analysis is more complex than popular interpretations suggest. In the earliest Sumerian texts, from the post-Akkadian period onward, the Anunnaki are described as a group of gods, specifically those of princely seed, a translation of the Sumerian components, An, Riven, Nun, Na. They are descendants of An, the sky god, the highest deity in the early Sumerian pantheon. But who exactly comprises this group, and how many gods it includes, remains unclear. One text mentions 50 Anunnaki of Eridu. Other texts reference 7. Still others suggest a much larger number. Their primary function is explicit. They decide fates. In the Mythenki and the World Order, line 207 states that the Anunnaki gods are those who decree destinies. This isn't merely a poetic flourish, it's a consistent characterization across multiple compositions. They don't simply exist as divine beings, they actively determine what will happen, both to other gods and to humanity. But the texts also associate them with the underworld. In Inanna's descent into the netherworld, line 167 describes how Inanna, the goddess of love and war, trespasses into the realm of the dead. There she encounters the Anunnaki, the 7 judges, who pass judgment on her transgression. This underworld association becomes more prominent in later texts, particularly after the Old Babylonian period, when the Anunnaki begin to be contrasted with another group called the Igigi. In this binary, the Igigi are gods of heaven, the Anunnaki are gods of the underworld. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, preserved on multiple tablets in the British Museum collection, offers specific numbers. Tablet 6, lines 39 through 44, describes how the god Marduk, after defeating the chaos dragon Tiamat and creating the ordered cosmos, assigns 300 Anunnaki to duty in the heavens and 300 to duty in the underworld. 600 Anunnaki in total, split between celestial and terrestrial chthonic realms, functioning as a kind of divine administration. What's crucial to understand is that ancient Mesopotamians themselves appear to have been somewhat confused about the term. A German scholar named Burkhard Kienast noted in his 1965 study that there was ambiguity surrounding the Anunnaki even in antiquity. Sometimes the term indicates the highest gods, the most powerful deities. Sometimes it indicates specifically underworld deities. Sometimes it seems to encompass the entire pantheon. The semantic range is frustratingly broad, but certain patterns remain consistent. The Anunnaki are collective, not individual. They act as council, not as solitary decision-makers. They exist at the boundary between divine and earthly realms, not fully transcendent like An or Enlil, not fully terrestrial like city patron gods. They judge, they decree. they determine outcomes, and in the flood narratives, they play a central role. The Atrahasis epic, an Akkadian composition preserved in multiple Old Babylonian copies, describes the creation of humanity in detail. The text opens with the gods divided into two groups, the senior gods who oversee everything, and the minor gods who bear the physical toil. The minor gods are digging canals, piling silt, dredging clay. They begin to complain about their labour. How long must we bear this toil? They ask. Enki, god of wisdom and the deep waters, devises a solution: create humans to perform the work that the minor gods resent. His mother, Nama, takes clay from the top of the Abzu, the cosmic freshwater ocean beneath the earth, and mixes it with the blood of a slain god. The text specifies that a rebel god named Weilu is killed for this purpose. His blood provides the divine component. The clay provides the earthly component. Ninmah, the mother goddess, shapes the mixture into human form. Humans, according to this account, are literally created from divine blood mixed with earth. Not purely mortal, not purely divine, but a hybrid, a mixture containing both elements. And the purpose is explicit: to serve the gods, to perform labour, to maintain the temples and cities. Time passes, humans multiply. And then the problem begins. The preserved portions of Atrahasis are fragmentary at this point, but the implication is clear. Humans become too numerous, too noisy, too troublesome. The Anunnaki Council convenes. Enlil, the chief god, proposes a solution: destroy them, send a flood, erase the mistake, and start over. But Enki, who helped create humans, feels differently. He warns Atrahasis, the exceedingly wise man for whom the text is named. Atrahasis builds a boat, survives the deluge, and humanity continues through his lineage. The pattern is important. The Anunnaki collectively decide. Their decision is apocalyptic, but one of them, Enki, consistently portrayed as humanity's ally, undermines the consensus and preserves a remnant. This same structure appears in the Eridu Genesis on CBS 106.7.3. The text is fragmentary, but what survives describes Enki revealing the god's plan to Jiusudra, urging him to build a boat. In Tablet C of the Epic of Gilgamesh, catalogue number K3375 at the British Museum, excavated from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, Utnapishtim recounts receiving similar warning from the god Ea, the Akkadian name for Enki. The message comes in a dream: through a reed wall, tear down your house, build a boat. Abandon possessions, seek life. Reject goods, keep alive your soul. 7 days and nights of flood in CBS 10673. 7 days and 6 nights in Gilgamesh. The numbers vary slightly, but the structure remains: divine counsel, divine decision, divine warning to one righteous individual, catastrophic flood, emergence into a changed world. The Anunnaki aren't merely characters in these stories. They're the mechanism. They're the ones who observe that something has gone wrong with the human experiment. They're the ones who decide correction is necessary. They're the ones whose judgment brings water. But the texts never quite explain what went wrong. Why did humanity need to be destroyed? The preserved passages reference noise: humans became too loud, disturbed the gods' rest. They reference numbers: too many humans. But there's an absence in the narrative, a space where motivation should be. It's as if the scribes assumed their readers already knew why the flood was necessary, so they didn't need to spell it out. Or perhaps the explanation was in the portions of CBS 1673 that didn't survive. 2/3 of the tablet is missing. The complete narrative would have been 3 times longer than what we possess. What was written in those lost sections? What did the original readers know that we've lost? The Anunnaki remain enigmatic. Not quite gods in the transcendent sense, not quite angels as later traditions would understand them, but something in between. Beings with power, with divine nature, with the ability to shape reality through decree, and with a direct invested interest in whether humanity succeeds or fails. Their name appears in administrative texts from the Ur III period, suggesting offerings were made to them. Their presence runs through Sumerian hymns, Akkadian epics, Babylonian creation accounts, underworld journey narratives, royal inscriptions. They're woven into the entire fabric of Mesopotamian thought, consistently described as those who judge and those who decide. And this raises the question that connects fragmented clay tablets in Philadelphia to scroll caves in the Judean desert. What if other cultures recorded similar beings under different names? Sons of the gods, daughters of humanity. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, is famously brief. 4 verses that have generated centuries of interpretive debate, theological controversy, and wildly divergent theories. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal, their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown." 4 verses. Then the flood account begins immediately afterward. No explanation of who the sons of God were. No clarification about what Nephilim means. No details about why this situation necessitated reducing human lifespan to 120 years, or 5 verses later, destroying nearly all of humanity with floodwaters. The Hebrew term Nephilim appears only twice in the entire Hebrew Bible, here in Genesis 6:4, and again in Numbers 13:33, where Israelite spies returning from Canaan report seeing the Nephilim, the descendants of Anak, and feeling like grasshoppers in comparison. The etymology is disputed. It may derive from naphal, meaning to fall, suggesting fallen ones or those who fell, or it might mean those who cause others to fall. The ancient Greek translation, the Septuagint, rendered it as gigantes, giants, which influenced all subsequent interpretation in Western tradition. Sons of God is equally problematic. The Hebrew phrase is B'nai Ha-Elohim, which in other Old Testament contexts clearly refers to divine beings. Job chapters 1 and 2 use the identical phrase to describe celestial beings who present themselves before the Lord, including the figure called the Satan. Job 38:7 refers to sons of God shouting for joy at creation. In these contexts, the phrase indicates non-human divine entities, but after the rise of Christianity, interpretive tradition shifted. Many Jewish and Christian commentators became uncomfortable with the idea of divine beings procreating with humans, so alternative explanations emerged. The sons of God were the godly line of Seth, Adam's third son, who intermarried with the wicked line of Cain. Or they were human rulers who took multiple wives. Or the passage is purely symbolic, describing moral corruption rather than literal interbreeding. These interpretations solve theological problems, but create textual problems. If the passage describes ordinary human intermarriage, why does it immediately precede the flood? Why are the offspring called Nephilim, a term that elsewhere indicates beings of unusual stature? Why does Genesis 6:4 specifically note that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, after the flood, suggesting something survived that wasn't supposed to? The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered between 1947 and 1956 in caves near Qumran, include fragments of a text called the Book of Giants. Catalogue numbers 4Q203, 1Q23, 2Q26, 4Q530, 532, and 6Q8. These fragments expand the Genesis 6 narrative extensively. The book describes the Watchers, divine beings who descend to earth, and their offspring, literal giants named Ohia and Haya, sons of Shemihaza, one of the Watcher leaders. The Book of Enoch, preserved in full in Ethiopian manuscripts, but also represented in Aramaic fragments at Qumran, provides even more detail. Chapter 6 describes 200 angels, called Watchers, who descend to Mount Hermon in the days of Jared, great-grandfather of Noah. Their leader, Semjaza, proposes a plan. Let us choose wives from among the daughters of men and beget us children. But he's concerned the others will abandon the plan and leave him solely culpable, so they swear an oath binding themselves together. All 200 descend. They take human wives. The women become pregnant and give birth to giants, Nephilim, described as enormous beings, 300 cubits tall according to some manuscripts, who consume all human resources and then begin consuming humans themselves. But the Watchers don't merely produce offspring, they teach. Azazel teaches men to make swords, knives, shields and armour, warfare technology. He teaches women cosmetics and jewellery. Semjaza teaches enchantments and root cutting. Armaros teaches the resolving of enchantments. Barakil teaches astrology. Kokkabil teaches the signs. Tamil teaches astronomy. Azradel teaches the course of the moon. The text frames this as forbidden knowledge, skills and information that humans weren't supposed to possess yet. The result is catastrophe. The giants ravage the earth. Humanity cries out. The archangels, Michael, Raphael, Gabriel and Uriel, petition God. God responds by commanding the flood, binding the Watchers beneath the earth until final judgment, and destroying the giants, whose disembodied spirits become demons that afflict humanity thereafter. This narrative, preserved by Jewish communities around the time of Jesus, treats Genesis 6:1-4 as literal historical record of actual divine-human hybridization that necessitated apocalyptic reset. Now return to Mesopotamia. The Sumerian king list describes rulers with impossibly long lives before the flood, dramatically shorter lives after. Genesis 5 describes the same pattern. Adam lived 930 years, Seth 912 years, Enosh 905 years, Methuselah 969 years, the antediluvian patriarchs averaging 912 years. After the flood, Noah lives 950 years, but his son Shem only 600, and the numbers continue declining until, by the time of Abraham, lifespans have reduced to what we consider normal human reign. The parallel is structural. Both traditions record abnormally extended lives before a catastrophic flood, followed by rapid reduction toward normal mortality. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes its protagonist as 2/3 god, 1/3 man. His mother is the goddess Ninsun, his father the legendary king Lugalbanda. Gilgamesh rules Uruk with superhuman strength and endurance. The text opens with his subjects complaining about his oppressive behaviour. He claims the right to sleep with every bride before her husband. He conscripts young men for building projects that exhaust them. The people cry out to the gods, who create Enkidu to challenge Gilgamesh. Even this solution involves mixing divine and earthly elements. Enkidu is formed from clay and spittle by the goddess Aruru, created as a wild man who must be civilized through contact with humanity. The pattern repeats. Divine-human mixture produces beings of unusual power who create problems requiring divine intervention. Lugalbanda, Gilgamesh's father, appears in his own epic cycles. The Sumerian king list assigns him a reign of 1200 years. The texts describe him receiving gifts from the Anzu bird, a cosmic creature, including supernatural speed. He's called a shepherd and is described with semi-divine qualities, though his precise genealogy remains murky. Tablet after tablet in Mesopotamian literature describes kings as sons of God. The phrase isn't metaphorical, it's presented as lineage. The kings claim descent from specific deities. They're not fully human according to their own inscriptions. They possess divine nature inherited from divine parents. The Sumerian text Enki and Ninmah, preserved on multiple Old Babylonian tablets including British Museum 1896, 032637, describes the creation of humanity as an intentional project involving gods and goddesses. But interestingly, it also describes attempts to create different kinds of humans, experimental variations, some of which Enki and Ninmah struggle to find purposes for. The text reads like laboratory notes, divine beings testing combinations, creating outcomes that don't quite work, adjusting the process. None of this proves the Genesis account, but it suggests Genesis 6001-4 isn't as unique as it appears. The concept of divine beings producing offspring with humans, resulting in powerful or unusual beings who exist in a problematic middle state between mortal and immortal, runs through multiple textual traditions that had no obvious connection to each other. The Book of Giants names specific individuals, Oya and Haya, Mahawe, Gilgamesh, explicitly included in the list of giants. The Mesopotamian texts name specific individuals, Gilgamesh, Lugalbanda, the antediluvian kings. Genesis names the Nephilim, but doesn't list individuals, except in Numbers 13, where the Anakim are called descendants of the Nephilim. The biblical text places this immediately before the flood account. The Mesopotamian texts describe the antediluvian period as a time of divine human proximity, followed by divine decision to send flood. The Enochian texts describe watcher descent and giant offspring, followed by petition to God and subsequent deluge. The structure is parallel. 4 divine beings interact with humans, 2 sickle offspring result, 3 sickle problems escalate, 4 divine council decides to destroy and reset, 5 flood comes, 6 sickle 1 righteous individual survives with family. The question isn't whether these accounts are identical. They're not. The question is whether they're reflecting something that actually happened, preserved through different cultural lenses, or whether they're independent mythological inventions that coincidentally share the same narrative structure. And if they are reflecting actual events, then what the Sumerians called Anunnaki and what the Hebrew text called sons of God might be the same beings, documented by different civilizations using different language for the same pre-flood reality. 7 who came down. The Apkallu tradition is one of the more fascinating elements of Mesopotamian literature, partly because it describes beings that don't fit neatly into divine or human categories. The word Apkallu, Abgol in Sumerian, translates as sage or wise one. Mesopotamian texts consistently describe 7 Apkallu who existed before the flood. They're sent by the god Enki from the sacred city Eridu. Their purpose is to teach humanity the arts of civilization, how to build temples, how to establish cities, how to organize society, how to practice divination and ritual. The Babylonian priest Berossus, writing in Greek around 290 BC, provides the most detailed preserved account. He calls them by Greek names, most famously Oannes, and describes them as amphibious beings who emerge from the sea during the day to teach humans, then return to the water at night. They look partly like men and partly like fish. They teach writing, mathematics, agriculture, law, and architecture. Because of their instruction, Berossus writes, nothing material has been added by way of improvement to their teaching. This last phrase is striking. The Apkallu didn't provide a foundation that humans then built upon. They provided complete knowledge. Civilization didn't gradually develop. It was transferred intact from these beings to humanity. Later Mesopotamian tradition names all 7: Uana, Uanaduga, Emaduga, Emegalama, Emabuluga, Anenlilda, and Utuabzu. Each is associated with a particular king and a particular city. They serve as advisors to antediluvian rulers. The first Apkallu, Uana, is linked to Alulim, the first king of Eridu, who according to the Sumerian king list ruled for 28,800 years. The 7th Apkallu, Utuabzu, is advisor to Zusudra, the flood hero. After the flood, the tradition changes. No more true Apkallu appear. Instead, humans of exceptional wisdom sometimes receive the title Apkallu, but the texts distinguish these as post-flood imitations, not the real thing. The original 7 existed before the deluge and do not return. Now consider the Book of Enoch's description of the Watchers. Chapter 6 lists the leaders: Semjaza, Arakil, Ramiel, Kokabil, Tamil, Ramiel, Danel, Ezekiel, Barakel, Asael, Amaros, Batriel, Ananel, Zakiel, Samsiel, Saturel, Turiel, Yomiel, Arizael. Different manuscripts give different names and different numbers, but the consistent element is that these are named individuals, each with specific role, each teaching specific knowledge. The knowledge they teach overlaps significantly with what the Apkallu supposedly taught: metalworking, enchantments, astrology, signs in the heavens, cosmetics, the cutting of roots, writing, mathematics. The primary difference is that the Enochian text frames this as transgression, forbidden knowledge given prematurely, while the Mesopotamian texts frame it as civilization being bestowed by benevolent culture heroes. Both traditions agree on several points. These beings came from the divine realm, they descended to earth, 3 taught humanity advanced knowledge, 4 they existed before the flood, 5 after the flood they no longer appear in the same way. The phrase "those who descended" appears in both traditions. The Watchers descend to Mount Hermon. The kingship descends from heaven in Sumerian texts. The Apkallu are sent down from Eridu, Enki's sacred city. The semantic pattern is vertical movement from a higher realm to the earthly realm. Jewish scholar Ida Frelich, in her 2016 article Mesopotamian Elements and the Watchers' Traditions, argues that the Enochian Watchers are directly influenced by Mesopotamian Apkallu traditions, adapted through Jewish interpretive lenses during and after the Babylonian exile. When Jewish scribes encountered Mesopotamian myths while living in Babylon, they recognized parallels to their own Genesis traditions and developed the Watcher mythology as a way of explaining Genesis 6:1-4 in greater detail, borrowing narrative structure from Apkallu accounts. This is plausible. Cultural exchange absolutely happened. The question is what the exchange consisted of. Did the Jewish scribes invent the Watcher story based on Mesopotamian templates, or did both cultures preserve older traditions about actual beings who performed these roles, with each tradition maintaining different elements of the original account? The Apkallu are consistently described as pre-flood. The Watchers descend in the days of Jared. Genesis 5:18 places Jared in the 8th generation from Adam, before Noah. Chronologically, both traditions place these teachers in the antediluvian period. The number 7 is sacred throughout Mesopotamian literature. 7 sages, 7 gates of the underworld, 7 Anunnaki judges in Inanna's descent. The Enochian tradition sometimes mentions 7 watchers specifically, though other passages expand the number to tens or hundreds. The structural similarity suggests either shared symbolism or shared memory, and here's where the connection to the Anunnaki becomes relevant. In some Mesopotamian texts, the Apkallu are described as servants or agents of the Anunnaki gods, particularly Enki. They're sent by divine authority to fulfill specific mission. They aren't independent actors. They're representatives of divine will, executing a plan determined by higher divine council. If the Anunnaki Council decided to establish civilization through human surrogates, the Apkallu would be the mechanism. If the Anunnaki decided that humans needed knowledge to develop properly, the Apkallu would be the teachers. And if the Anunnaki later decided that the experiment had failed and needed to be reset via flood, the Apkallu would have been removed, which is exactly what the texts describe. After the flood, no more true Apkallu. The Enochian account provides motivation that the Mesopotamian texts largely omit. The Watchers don't descend to help humanity. They descend because they desire human women. Their teaching is secondary, almost incidental, or perhaps it's bribery, a way to ingratiate themselves with human society so they can more easily access what they want. The results are catastrophic, giants born from illicit unions, forbidden knowledge spread prematurely, violence and corruption spreading until God must intervene with water. The Mesopotamian version sanitizes this. The Apkallu are wise helpers. Civilization is a gift, not a corruption. But the timeline is identical. Teaching happens, knowledge spreads, flood comes, the teachers don't return. What if both are true? What if beings came, taught, and interacted with humanity in the pre-flood world, but different cultures remembered them differently based on which aspects their traditions emphasized? The Mesopotamians, living in the land where this supposedly occurred, remembered them as foundational to their civilization, and thus described them positively. The Hebrew tradition, looking back at the same events from outside Mesopotamia, emphasized the transgressive elements, the boundary violation, the corruption introduced, the divine-human mixture that shouldn't have happened. Neither text denies that beings came down. Neither text denies that they taught. Neither text denies the flood that followed. What they differ on is interpretation. Were the beings heroes or transgressors? Was the knowledge a gift or a theft? Was the outcome civilization or corruption? The tablets don't answer this. They simply state that it happened before the flood. There were those who came from the divine realm to the earthly realm, who taught, who interacted, who left knowledge and offspring behind. Then water came, and after the water, the world was different. The flood tablets speak. CBS 1I673 preserves only fragments of what must have been a much longer narrative, but what remains is specific. The text describes divine instruction before the flood. Cities are to be built, each under the protection of designated deities. Then comes the crucial section, badly broken but reconstructible from parallel texts. Enki reveals the gods' plan. The Anunnaki have decided. Not Enki alone. The text is clear that this is a council decision. But Enki, the god of wisdom and deep waters, goes against the consensus. He approaches Isudra, described as a king, and reveals what's coming. The exact words are lost in the break, but the meaning is preserved. Build something, prepare for water, save yourself and life. The command isn't subtle. In the parallel account in Gilgamesh Tablet C, catalogue number K3375, housed in the British Museum, excavated from Nineveh's libraries, Utnapishtim recounts how the god Ea-Arcadian name for Enki speaks to him through a reed wall. The words are preserved: reed hut, wall, wall, reed hut, hearken, wall, reflect, man of Shuruppak, son of Ubaratutu, tear down your house, build a boat, abandon possessions, seek life, spurn property, keep the soul alive. Aboard the boat, take the seed of all living things. The dimensions follow: 7 stories, 9 compartments on each side, 120 cubits in height, 120 cubits in width. Essentially a cube, not designed to go anywhere, just to float and endure. Utnapishtim covers it with pitch inside and outside. He loads it with silver, gold, living beings, his family, craftsmen, and the beasts of the field. Then the storm. 6 days and 7 nights the south wind blows, the flood carrying away everything. Even the gods are terrified, according to Tablet C. They retreat to the highest heaven and crouch like dogs. Ishtar cries out in regret. The Anunnaki gods weep with her. When the water finally subsides, Utnapishtim opens a window and looks out at a world transformed. Mountains emerging from receding water, corpses floating everywhere, everything turned to clay. The boat lands on Mount Nimush. Utnapishtim waits 7 days, then releases a dove. It finds nowhere to land and returns. He releases a swallow. It also returns. Then a raven. The raven doesn't return. It finds land with receding water, feeds on carrion and doesn't come back. Utnapishtim exits the boat and offers sacrifice. The gods smell the sweet savour and gather around it like flies. But Enlil is furious. How did any human survive? Who revealed the plan? Enk confesses, I did it. I made sure that the seed of life was preserved. Enlil relents. Instead of destroying Utnapishtim for surviving, he grants him immortality and places him at the mouth of the rivers in a distant paradisiacal location. The Atrahasis epic, preserved in old Babylonian copies from around 1700 BC, provides additional context. The text opens with the gods performing labour, specifically dredging canals and piling silt. The minor gods complain about this toil for 3,600 years ours in the sexagesimal system. Finally, they revolt. They burn their tools, surround Enlil's house at night, and refuse to continue working. Enlil summons the senior gods, Anu-Ea, and the warrior god, Ninurta. After deliberation, Ea proposes creating humans from clay and divine blood to take over the labour. The goddess Nintu, also called Ninmar or Beletili, shapes the clay. They slaughter a god, specifically Weilu, the god who had understanding, and mix his blood and flesh with the clay. The first humans emerge, created explicitly to serve gods, humans proliferate. The text says 1200 years pass, then another 1200 years. By the time 2400 years have elapsed since human creation, the noise becomes unbearable. The text uses the word hubru, meaning uproar or commotion. Enlil can't sleep. He complains to the divine council the noise of mankind has become too much. I am losing sleep over their racket. The gods attempt solutions short of total destruction, first a plague, then a drought, then a famine. Each time, Ea instructs Atrahasis how to counter the threat through prayer and offerings to specific gods. Each time, humanity survives. Finally, Enlil loses patience. He makes the other gods swear an oath not to warn humanity this time. The solution will be flood, comprehensive, unavoidable, final. But Ea is technically god of water, and he finds a loophole. He can't directly tell Atrahasis because of the oath, so he tells a reed wall while Atrahasis happens to be on the other side. Reed wall, pay attention. Wall, listen carefully. The warning comes through indirect speech. Atrahasis understands, builds the boat, and survives with his family and animals. After the flood, when the gods realize humans survived, Enlil again rages. But this time, a compromise is reached. Humans may continue, but their numbers and noise will be controlled through natural means. Disease, predation, and crucially, sterility for some women, infant mortality, and restrictions on childbearing. The text frames this as the reason why not all women bear children and why not all children survive, a divine throttle on human population implemented after the flood. CBS 10673 doesn't preserve this much detail, but the surviving sections align: divine decision, divine warning to one man, flood lasting 7 days, emergence after water recedes, sacrifice offered, divine response. The structure is identical across 3 separate textual traditions, written in 2 languages, spanning at least 500 years of composition. The question is why? If this is pure invention, why do independent sources preserve the same narrative sequence? If it's theological allegory, why ground it in specific geography, real cities like Shuruppak, real rivers like the Euphrates, real mountains like Nimush, possibly the Kurdish Pir Omar Gudrun range? Archaeology provides ambiguous evidence. The Near East did experience catastrophic regional flooding multiple times during the early Bronze Age. Excavations at Ur discovered a distinctive layer of clean water-laid clay 2.5 metres thick in some areas, suggesting massive inundation. Similar flood deposits appear at Kish, Shuruppak, Uruk and Lagash, but dated to different periods, ranging from 4000 to 2900, suggesting localised floods rather than a single universal deluge. Yet the tablets don't claim universal coverage. They describe comprehensive regional destruction. For the Mesopotamian plain, flat, low-lying, crisscrossed by rivers, a catastrophic flood lasting a week could indeed appear world-ending to those experiencing it. The entire visible world, from horizon to horizon, submerged. Every city they knew, underwater. Everyone they knew, drowned. From their perspective, the world ended. But the texts never say this was natural disaster. They insist it was decision. The Anunnaki Council convened, evaluated humanity, found the situation untenable, and determined to erase what existed. Not weather, not tectonic activity, not random catastrophe, judgment. The reason given is noise, which seems almost trivial. But what if noise is metaphor? What if it represents disorder, corruption, the wrong kind of activity, perhaps related to the divine-human mixing described in Genesis 6? The texts don't spell this out, possibly because the original audiences already knew. The scribes assumed cultural context we lack, or possibly the explanation was in the missing 2/3 of CBS 10673. The tablet once held 260 lines. We have perhaps 80 lines preserved across 6 columns. What did the lost 180 lines say? Why was the flood necessary? What had humanity done or become that required annihilation? The Book of Enoch claims to know Humanity had been corrupted by Watcher teaching and Nephilim violence. The earth was filled with bloodshed. The knowledge of forbidden arts had spread, and the genetic mixing of divine and human had produced beings that shouldn't exist. All of this required reset. The Mesopotamian texts remain more circumspect. They describe the decision, the flood, the survival, the aftermath, but they don't quite explain the crime. The noise is mentioned, the numbers are mentioned, and repeatedly the texts reference the Anunnaki deciding fates, passing judgment, determining that this phase of human existence must end. One righteous individual survives in every version. One man who found favour, who was warned, who took action, who preserved seed. Not because he was perfect, the texts don't claim that, but because someone needed to survive to continue the line. The story had to keep going. And after the water, everything changed. The king list shows it numerically. Pre-flood rains averaging 30,000 years, post-flood rains dropping to 1,100, then 600, then 400, eventually reaching normal human range. Genesis shows it identically. Pre-flood patriarchs living 900 plus years, post-flood generations declining rapidly until lifespans stabilise around 120 years. The world after the flood is not the world before. The tablets document the break. Whatever rules governed the antediluvian age no longer apply in the post-diluvian age. Something fundamental changed. The text suggests it wasn't just water level. When gods took wives, the phrase appears in Genesis 6:2, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. The verb used lakak means to take, to seize, to select. Not merely marry through normal cultural process, but actively choose and take. This isn't portrayed as mutual courtship. The divine beings see, desire and take. The text suggests compulsion, not romance. And the result is specific. They were the heroes of old, men of renown, Genesis 6:4. The offspring aren't ordinary. They're Gibrim, mighty ones, warriors, famous individuals who become legendary. The Gilgamesh tradition provides a Mesopotamian parallel. The epic describes Gilgamesh as Ina'it Ilti Alu Alti, 2 parts god, 1 part man. His mother Ninsun is explicitly a goddess, his father Lugalbanda a deified king. This makes Gilgamesh neither fully divine nor fully human, but something between, possessing superhuman strength and endurance. The opening of the epic describes Gilgamesh oppressing the people of Uruk. Specifically, the text indicates he claims just prime noctis, the right to sleep with every bride before her husband. The young men are exhausted from his building projects. The people cry out to the gods, "You created him, now create his equal to challenge him so our lives can have peace." This framing is significant. Gilgamesh's behaviour is directly attributed to his semi-divine nature. He's too powerful for ordinary human society to check. He does what he wants because he can, because he's other, because normal rules don't apply to him. The solution requires divine intervention, creating Enkidu, another human-divine mixture, to balance him. The structure mirrors the Genesis account. Divine human offspring cause problems. Humanity cries out. Divine realm responds with intervention. The difference is that in Gilgamesh, the intervention creates an equal to restrain the hero, while in Genesis, the intervention is destructive flood. Lugalbanda's own epic cycles describe him as someone who receives divine favour and gifts. During a military campaign to Aratta, probably the Ararat region, Lugalbanda becomes separated from the army while sick. He's left behind in a mountain cave. When he recovers, he encounters the Anzu bird, a cosmic creature, thunderbird-like, and offers it food and respect. In gratitude, Anzu grants him supernatural speed and endurance, abilities that allow him to traverse vast distances almost instantaneously. The Sumerian king list assigns Lugalbanda a reign of 1,200 years. Whether literal or symbolic, the text places him in the category of post-flood rulers who still possess extended lifespans, though nowhere near the antediluvian kings, tens of thousands of years. He's described as the shepherd, a title later kings claimed to legitimize their rule by connecting themselves to this legendary figure. Gilgamesh's son, Ur-Nungol, is also listed as a king of Uruk in the king list, reigning for 30 years, a normal human lifespan. The divine blood dilutes. The semi-divine hero has a mortal son. Whatever mixture Gilgamesh represented, it didn't transmit fully to the next generation. This pattern of gradual reduction toward normalcy appears elsewhere in Mesopotamian royal ideology. Early kings claimed direct descent from gods. Later kings claim to be chosen by gods, but don't claim divine parentage. Eventually, kings are simply legitimized by priest-bestowed blessing from temples. The relationship between divine and human becomes increasingly mediated, less direct, more symbolic. The Sumerian composition Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta describes the legendary king Enmerkar, who the king list places as second king of the first dynasty of Uruk, ruling for 420 years. The text portrays him as a figure of unusual wisdom and ability, able to communicate with gods, able to intimidate rival kings through displays of power. Though not explicitly called part divine in the preserved texts, his characterization suggests he's not ordinary human. The tradition of divine kingship in Mesopotamia was not metaphorical. The kings identified themselves as offspring or chosen agents of specific deities. The king of Ur was the human husband of the goddess Inanna. A sacred marriage ritual annually renewed this divine human connection. The king of Babylon was servant of Marduk. The pharaohs of Egypt were incarnations of Horus. Throughout the ancient Near East, the boundary between human ruler and divine realm was understood to be permeable, with kings occupying liminal space between mortals and gods. But the hero traditions go further. They don't merely claim divine favour or symbolic marriage, they claim genealogical descent, divine parent and human parent, producing exceptional offspring. The Book of Enoch describes this in catastrophic terms. When the 200 watchers take human wives, the women become pregnant and give birth to giants. Different manuscript traditions give different heights. Some say 300 cubits, about 450 feet. Some say 3,000 ells, nearly a mile high. Some give more modest, but still superhuman measurements. The numbers are probably symbolic, but the point is clear. These offspring were not normal humans. The Book of Giants, preserved in fragments at Qumran, names specific individuals. Oya and Haya, the two sons of Shemiaza, the Watcher leader. They're described as troubling the earth, consuming all human resources. When food runs out, they begin eating humans. The text describes their enormous size and their violence. One fragment, 4Q203, records Oya having ominous dreams about the coming destruction, prompting him and his brother to send Mahaway, another giant, to consult Enoch, the human prophet who had been taken by God into the heavenly realms. Enoch's response, according to the fragments, confirms the worst. Judgment is coming, the giants will be destroyed, the watchers will be bound until the final judgment, and the earth will be cleansed. The giants, understanding their fate, spend their final days in fear. The Mesopotamian hero traditions don't contain this moral framework. Gilgamesh isn't destroyed for his mixed nature, he's the protagonist, the hero king whose wisdom and accomplishments are celebrated. Lugalbanda becomes deified after death, worshipped in later periods. Enmerkar is remembered as founder of cultural achievements. The semi-divine status is portrayed as legitimizing, not condemning. But both traditions agree that divine-human mixture produces beings of exceptional power, extended lifespan, unusual abilities, and often problematic behaviour requiring divine intervention to manage. Both traditions place these figures before or shortly after the flood. Both traditions suggest this mixing was relatively common in the early world and became rare or ceased afterward. Numbers 1333 provides a crucial biblical data point. When Israelite spies scout the land of Canaan, they report, "We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak, come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. This is centuries after the flood. If Genesis 6 describes pre-flood Nephilim, who all died in the deluge, how are there Nephilim descendants in Canaan? Two possibilities: either some Nephilim genetic line survived the flood Noah's sons, or their wives carrying the genes, or post-flood divine human interaction occurred again, producing a second generation of unusual beings. Genesis 6:4 is ambiguous. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. Afterward when? After the sons of God took wives, or after the flood? The Canaanite giant clans, Anakim, Rephaim, Zamzummim, Emim, are described in multiple biblical texts as remnants of older populations, unusually tall or powerful, occupying the land before Israel. King Og of Bashan, described in Deuteronomy 3:11, had an iron bed 13 feet long and 6 feet wide. Whether this was his actual size or a symbolic measure of power, the text presents him as exceptional, different from normal humans. The Mesopotamian king list places Gilgamesh's dynasty in the post-flood period. He's not antediluvian. His semi-divine status exists after the reset, suggesting that whatever rules separated divine and human hadn't been fully re-established after the deluge, or that some divine beings continued interacting with humans despite the judgment that had occurred. The question the texts raise is whether divine-human mixing was the cause of the flood or merely a symptom of deeper corruption. Did the mixing itself violate cosmic order, or did the mixing produce beings whose behaviour, violence, consumption, teaching forbidden knowledge, social disruption made the flood necessary? The tablets don't explicitly say. What they document is the fact beings of mixed divine human nature existed. They were called heroes and mighty ones. They became legendary, and their existence is temporally linked to the catastrophic flood that separated the old world from the new. The geography of giants. The biblical text preserves specific tribal names associated with unusual size or power, concentrated in particular geographic regions. Deuteronomy 2 and 3 provide the most comprehensive list. The Rephaim, who lived east of the Jordan, the Emim, whom the Moabites called Rephaim, but the Moabites called them Emim, the Zamzummim, whom the Ammonites encountered, and the Anakim in the southern hill country of Canaan. King Og of Bashan, last of the Rephaim according to Deuteronomy 3:11, ruled territories in the Golan Heights and surrounding regions. The text specifies his bed was on display in Rabbah, the Ammonite capital Daman Jordan, 9 cubits long, 13.5 feet, and 4 cubits wide. Whether actual bed or symbolic sarcophagus, the measurement indicates someone or something exceptional. The land of Canaan, according to Numbers 13, contained people of great size, including the descendants of Anak, which the spies specifically identify as coming from the Nephilim. The encounter terrifies the Israelites so much that 10 of the 12 spies recommend abandoning the conquest. Only Joshua and Caleb argue for proceeding. Joshua 11:21-22 describes Joshua's later campaign against the Anakim. At that time, Joshua went and destroyed the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, Debir and Anab, from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua totally destroyed them and their towns. No Anakim were left in Israelite territory. Only in Gaza, Gath and Ashdod did any survive. The city of Gath is significant. 1 Samuel 17 describes Goliath as a champion named Goliath, from Gath 6 cubits and a span in height, wearing bronze armour weighing 5,000 shekels, 125. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and the iron point weighed 600 shekels, 15. The text presents him not as a genetic anomaly, but as a normal member of his people. The Philistines of Gath evidently had multiple large warriors, as 2 Samuel 21 lists additional giant Philistines, Ishbi-Benob, Saph, and Lami, brother of Goliath, plus an unnamed man with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. This geographic concentration is notable. The giant clans aren't spread evenly across the ancient Near East. They cluster in specific regions: the Transjordan east of the Jordan River, southern Canaan, and the coastal Philistine cities. These are precisely the regions closest to Mesopotamia, or influenced by Mesopotamian culture through trade routes and population movement. The Rephaim appear in multiple contexts in biblical text. Beyond being a tribal name, the word also refers to shades or spirits of the dead in the underworld. Isaiah 14:9 and Psalm 88:10 use Rephaim to indicate deceased persons in Sheol. This double meaning, both living giant clan and underworld spirits, creates interpretive complexity. Were the giants called Rephaim because they became shades after death? Or did the word Rephaim originally mean something else that applied to both categories? Genesis 14:5 mentions the Rephaim, placing them in the time of Abraham, centuries before the Israelite conquest. The text describes them as living in Ashtaroth-Karnaim when attacked by the coalition of kings led by Kedorlaomer. This means the giant clans weren't post-Exodus phenomena, they were established populations occupying the land during the patriarchal period, roughly 2800 BCE. Genesis 15:18-21 lists the Rephaim among the peoples whose land God promises to Abraham's descendants: Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaim, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. The Rephaim are included matter-of-factly as established inhabitants, not as mythical beings. Archaeology offers ambiguous evidence. No skeletal remains of 9-foot humans have been verified from Bronze Age Canaan. The average height of male skeletons from the period is approximately 5'5" to 5'7". Occasional individuals reached 6 feet, which would have been notably tall for the population, but not gigantic in the sense the biblical texts seem to describe. However, scholars note that giant in ancient Near Eastern texts often indicated social status or military prowess rather than literal height. The Akkadian term Kardu, warrior, mighty one, and the Hebrew gibber T-man, hero, emphasize power and effectiveness in battle, not necessarily physical stature. When the biblical text calls someone a giant, it might mean an elite warrior, a member of a dominant military caste, or someone of exceptional fighting ability, terrifying to face in battle, regardless of literal height. But the specificity of measurements like Og's bed and Goliath's armour suggests the writers meant something beyond metaphor. 9 cubits is too specific to be purely symbolic. Either these measurements represent actual individuals of unusual size, or they represent legendary inflation of normal individuals whose memory grew with retelling. The Mesopotamian king list doesn't describe its antediluvian kings as physically large, it describes them as extraordinarily long-lived. The focus is temporal rather than spatial. But the Sumerian hero traditions do emphasize physical power and endurance. Gilgamesh's strength is superhuman. Lugalbander's speed surpasses normal human ability. Enmerkar's stamina in siege warfare is portrayed as exceptional. The connection between Mesopotamian plain and Canaanite highlands is geographic and cultural. Trade routes ran from Ur and Babylon westward through Mari and Ebla to the Mediterranean coast. Population movements occurred regularly. When Abram Permita Abraham travels from Ur to Canaan in Genesis 11:12, he's following established routes connecting these regions. If divine human mixing or post-flood residual populations existed in Mesopotamia, migration westward would bring these lineages to Canaan. The giant clans could represent descendants of survivors or later generations carrying genetic legacy from antediluvian mixing. Their concentration in regions closest to Mesopotamian cultural influence supports this possibility. Amos 2.9 provides an interesting detail. Yet I destroyed the Amorites before them, though they were tall as cedars and strong as oaks. I destroyed their fruit above and their roots below. The Amorites are described with similar language to the Anakim, exceptional height and strength. The Amorites originated in the Syrian desert and northern Mesopotamian regions before moving into Canaan. Again, the connection runs eastward towards Sumer and Akkad. The biblical texts don't claim these populations were common everywhere, only in specific regions where they were established before Israelite arrival and where their presence posed significant military threat. The texts also document their gradual elimination, Joshua's campaigns, David's defeat of Goliath, the later conquests that removed them from the land. By the end of the biblical historical period, the giant clans are gone. They don't appear in Persian period texts. They're not mentioned in Hellenistic sources. Whatever they were, genetically unusual populations, elite military castes, or legendary memories of earlier peoples, they existed during a specific historical window and then disappeared. The Sumerian king list shows parallel pattern: antediluvian extraordinary reigns, early post-flood extended reigns, gradual reduction to normal. The biblical accounts show similar progression: pre-flood Nephilim, post-flood giant clans in Canaan, gradual elimination until none remain. If the pattern in both traditions reflects actual history, it suggests whatever produced these unusual populations was time-limited, linked to the antediluvian or early post-flood period, and gradually bred out or was actively eliminated from human populations. The tablets document the geography. The giant clans weren't universal. They occupied specific territories, traceable on maps, associated with regions closest to Mesopotamian origin, as if something began there and spread westward along trade routes and migration paths until it was finally extinguished in the hill country of Canaan. What the judges knew. In Inanna's descent to the netherworld, the goddess Inanna decides to visit her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld. The text is explicit about Inanna's preparation. She dresses in her full divine regalia, takes her 7 divine powers, Bona Descend, and descends to the realm of the dead. At each of 7 gates, the gatekeeper forces her to remove one item: crown, lapis beads, twin egg-shaped beads, breastplate, gold bracelet, lapis measuring rod and line, royal robe. By the time she enters Ereshkigal's throne room, she's naked and powerless. The text states in line 167, the Anunna, the 7 judges, rendered their decision against her. The 7 Anunnaki in this context function as underworld judges, determining the fate of souls or divine beings who enter the realm of death. Their judgment against Inanna is execution. She's struck dead, her corpse hung on a hook. Only through the intervention of Enki, who creates special beings to rescue her, does Inanna escape. This judicial role of the Anunnaki appears repeatedly in Mesopotamian underworld literature. They're not torturers or demons, they're magistrates, assessing cases and rendering verdicts according to cosmic law. Their judgments are described as binding, not subject to appeal. When they decide a fate, that fate occurs. The number 7 is significant. 7 judges, 7 gates, 7 items removed. The pattern structures the entire composition. Whether the 7 Anunnaki judges are the same as the 7 Apkallu sages is never explicitly stated, but the numerical correspondence is notable. 7 divine beings who decree fates, 7 divine beings who brought knowledge. If they're not identical, they're at minimum parallel structures within Mesopotamian cosmic organization. The Book of Enoch describes a similar judicial proceeding. After the Watchers descend, take wives, produce giants, and teach forbidden knowledge, the cries of humanity reach the 4 archangels, Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel. They in turn report to God. The result is judgment. The Watchers are to be bound in the valleys of the earth until final judgment. The giants are to be destroyed by setting them against each other. The spirits of the dead giants will become demons afflicting humanity, and the earth will be cleansed by flood. The structure is judicial, crime reported, evidence assessed, sentence pronounced, sentence executed. The Watchers don't receive trial. Their guilt is apparent from their actions. But the process is formal, not arbitrary. It follows cosmic law regarding boundaries that were violated. The parallel between 7 Anunnaki judges and the angelic court that judges the Watchers suggests similar concepts operating in different cultural frameworks. Both traditions describe divine councils that assess situations, determine appropriate response, and execute judgment. Both place these councils at critical junctures in human history, particularly around the flood event. The Atrahasis epic describes the Anunnaki council meeting to decide humanity's fate. The text presents a debate. Enlil argues for destruction, Enki argues for mercy, or at least for preserving a remnant. The council sides with Enlil. Humans must be limited or destroyed because they've become too problematic. But Enki's minority position allows him to technically obey while undermining the decision by warning Atrahasis. This internal divine conflict appears in Genesis as well, though more subtly. Genesis 6,006-7 states, "The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created." But then Noah found favour in the eyes of the Lord, 6:8. The decision to destroy is universal, but an exception is made for one righteous individual. Whether this exception represents internal divine debate, as in Atrar, or simply divine grace, isn't specified in Genesis. But the pattern is similar. Council decides on comprehensive judgment, one divine voice, or one divine act of mercy, preserves a remnant. The concept of forbidden knowledge connects to judicial proceedings. The Book of Enoch specifies what the Watchers taught and why it was problematic. Not merely skills, but skills that corrupted. Metallurgy for weapons enabled violence. Cosmetics enabled vanity and sexual temptation. Astrology enabled divination and reliance on fate rather than divine will. Root cutting enabled sorcery and manipulation of natural law. Enchantments enabled control over others. The Mesopotamian tradition doesn't frame Aklu teaching as forbidden, but it does recognise that knowledge can be dangerous. The concept of me, divine decrees or cosmic laws that govern reality, includes wisdom, craft knowledge, and ritual understanding. But me can be stolen or misused. In Inanna and the God of Wisdom, Inanna gets Enki drunk and tricks him into giving her the me that belonged to Uruk, which causes cosmic disruption until they're properly distributed. Knowledge has power. Power can corrupt. Those who possess and distribute knowledge bear responsibility for how it's used. If the Apkallu or Watchers gave knowledge to humanity prematurely, before humans had wisdom or ethical framework to use it properly, they enabled corruption regardless of their intent. The Anunnaki as judges suggests they evaluated not just human behaviour, but also divine behaviour. The gods themselves could be held accountable. Enlil's decision to flood humanity is questioned by other gods. The Watchers are judged and punished for their transgressions. Divine beings aren't above cosmic law, they're subject to it, just as humans are. This raises uncomfortable implications. If the Anunnaki were judges who decreed the flood after evaluating both humanity and the divine beings who interacted with humanity, then the flood wasn't merely punishment for human wickedness, it was correction of a situation where boundaries had been violated by both sides. The Enochian tradition is explicit. The Watchers sinned by leaving their proper estate, 6-7, taking human wives, and teaching forbidden arts. Their offspring, the Nephilim/giants, became violent and corrupted the earth. The flood was necessary to cleanse both the genetic corruption and the social corruption introduced by Watcher interference. The Mesopotamian tradition is more subtle, but the structure is similar. Gods created humans for specific purpose, humans multiplied beyond parameters, divine human boundaries became unclear, noise disorder escalated, divine council met to restore order through reset. Inanna's judgment by the 7 Anunnaki in the underworld provides a template for how this cosmic justice operates. The accused enters the judgment space, evidence is considered, verdict is rendered, sentence is executed. No defence attorney, no jury of peers. The judges are divine authorities whose understanding of cosmic law exceeds any argument the accused might make. If this judicial function applied to the pre-flood situation, it means the Anunnaki assessed evidence. Divine beings had descended and interacted inappropriately with humans, producing hybrid offspring. Forbidden knowledge had been taught. Human society had become corrupted. Violence and disorder were spreading. The verdict, reset is necessary. The sentence, flood. The execution, 7 days and nights of water. But the same judicial council allowed an exception. Why? Because complete erasure would violate cosmic law as thoroughly as the corruption did. Life must continue. The seed must be preserved. One righteous individual provides legal basis for mercy within judgment. The tablets document this judicial function repeatedly. The Anunnaki aren't merely powerful, they're specifically those who judge, who decree, who determine fates. They operate according to law, even when that law requires catastrophic intervention. And the fact that they're associated with the underworld, the realm of death, the place souls go for judgment after life, connects them to endings. They appear when a cycle completes, when a judgment must be rendered, when a decision determines whether something continues or ceases. The flood was ending. The antediluvian world was judged, found wanting, and terminated. What came after was new world, new rules, new boundaries. The Anunnaki decreed it. The water executed it. And those who survived emerged into a reality where the old order no longer applied. The names beneath the names. Etymology provides clues, though rarely certainty. The Sumerian term Anunna breaks down as an sky, plus nun, mintly, plus na-fa, those of princely seed or offspring of heaven. The Akkadian adaptation, Anunnaki, adds the determinative key, suggesting those of princely seed who are of earth, celestial beings operating in terrestrial realm. The Hebrew term Nephilim most likely derives from Nafal, rendering fallen ones or those who have fallen. The Greek Septuagint translated it as Gigantes, but this may reflect interpretive gloss rather than literal meaning. The verb nephal can indicate physical falling, moral falling, or falling upon someone in attack. Each nuance changes how we understand the term. Are they fallen angels, fallen in battle, or those who fell upon humans? Watchers in the Book of Enoch translates the Aramaic Erin, which also means wakeful ones. The term appears in Daniel 4:13, 17, 23 as an angelic class who remain perpetually awake, observing earthly events and reporting to God. Their ceaseless vigilance is definitional. They're those who watch, who see, who maintain awareness of human activity. Apkallu in Akkadian corresponds to Sumerian Abgal, which combines Ab, particularly the cosmic waters of the Abzu, and Gal, thus great ones of the waters or great water beings, which aligns with Berosus's description of them as semi-aquatic, emerging from the sea to teach during day and returning to water at night. The terms don't correspond exactly, but they share semantic fields. All four indicate beings who originate from somewhere else, heaven, divine realm, cosmic waters, and come to terrestrial realm. All four suggest some degree of power, wisdom, or status beyond normal humans. All four appear in pre-flood or antediluvian contexts. Functionally, the categories overlap. The Anunnaki decree fates, judge, determine cosmic order. They're collective, not individual. They operate by council decision. They exist at the boundary between divine and earthly realms. The Watchers descend to earth, take human wives, teach knowledge, produce offspring. They violate boundaries between divine and human. Their actions result in judgment and their binding in the earth. The Apkallu descend from Enki's realm, teach civilization to humanity, serve as advisors to antediluvian kings. They bring knowledge from divine source to human sphere. After the flood, they don't return. The Nephilim result from union of divine beings and human women. They become mighty men of old, men of renown, Genesis 6:4. They're associated with violence and disorder. Their presence immediately precedes the flood. The question is whether these represent 4 different categories of beings or 4 cultural perspectives on the same category. If the Anunnaki Council decided to establish civilization through human agents, the Apkallu would be those agents, sent by the Anunnaki, acting on their decree, fulfilling their plan. The Watchers could be Apkallu who violated their mandate, interacting with humans beyond teaching, producing offspring they shouldn't have produced. The Nephilim would be the result of that violation, the physical evidence that boundaries had been crossed. This reading makes the categories sequential rather than separate.
Anunnaki Council decides civilization should be established. Apkallu descend to teach. 3 are free. Some Apkallu transgress by taking wives. Nephilim result from those unions. Anunnaki Council reconvenes, judges.
The situation corrupted, decrees flood. 60 water comes. 70 Apkallu don't return after flood. Watchers are bound. Nephilim die. New order begins. The linguistic evidence is suggestive rather than conclusive. Ancient Sumerian, Akkadian, Hebrew and Aramaic aren't linguistically related languages. Sumerian is language isolate, no known relatives. Akkadian is Semitic, related to Hebrew and Aramaic. Direct cognates between Sumerian and Hebrew terms are rare and usually result from borrowing rather than shared origin. But concepts can transfer without vocabulary transfer. If Hebrew scribes encountered Mesopotamian texts during Babylonian exile 597-538b, they would have learnt about Anunnaki and Apkallu through Akkadian intermediaries. When writing their own traditions in Hebrew, they might use existing Hebrew terms, Nephilim, B'nai Elohim, to describe similar concepts, not because the words are linguistically related, but because the concepts corresponded. The Book of Enoch, composed during Second Temple period 300 BC 100 C, shows clear Mesopotamian influence in its angelology, astronomy and cosmic geography. The elaborate hierarchies of angels, the division of heavens into multiple levels, the detailed listing of angel names and functions all reflect Mesopotamian influence thought mixed with Hebrew monotheism. The Watchers in Enoch function similarly to Apkallu. They descend to teach, they're numbered to number, they have individual names and assigned roles. But unlike the Mesopotamian tradition which treats Apkallu positively, Enoch frames Watchers as transgressors who corrupted humanity by premature knowledge transfer. The difference might be perspective. From Mesopotamian viewpoint, living in the civilization the Apkallu supposedly established, they're culture heroes who should be celebrated. From Hebrew viewpoint, living as monotheists who rejected the Mesopotamian pantheon, any divine beings other than God who descended to interact with humans must be fallen angels, transgressors whose actions corrupted rather than civilized. Same events, opposite moral framing. The Nephilim-Anunnaki connection is most intriguing because both terms appear before flood accounts, both are associated with divine human boundary crossing, and both traditions place them in the same geographic region, Mesopotamia and surrounding areas. If Nephilim means fallen ones, and Anunnaki means those of princely seed who are on earth, the terms describe similar category from different angles. Beings with heavenly origin who are present on earth, whose earthly presence is somehow problematic or transgressive. Genesis 6:4 includes a curious phrase, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. The phrase, and also afterward, Manchre, has puzzled interpreters for millennia. After what? After the sons of God took wives? After the flood? The syntax is ambiguous, possibly deliberately so. If Nephilim existed afterward, after the flood, it means either their genetics survived through the flood survivors, or new divine-human mixing occurred post-flood. Numbers 13's reference to Nephilim in Canaan the Anakim suggests some form of continuation. The Mesopotamian king list similarly shows continuation. Post-flood kings have extended but reduced lifespans compared to antediluvian kings. The divine blood hasn't disappeared, just diluted. Gilgamesh is 2/3 God, suggesting his grandparent generation included divine elements that carried through. The pattern in both traditions, strong divine human mixing before flood, reduced but continuing mixing after flood, gradual decrease until it disappears or becomes undetectable. Linguistically, the terms don't prove connection, but structurally, functionally, temporally, geographically, they correspond in ways that suggest either shared events documented from different perspectives or shared mythological templates applied to civilization origin narratives. The tablets preserve the names Anunnaki, Apkallu, Watchers, Nephilim. Whether these are 4 names for one category or 4 separate categories that interacted is unclear. What's clear is that multiple ancient traditions, using different languages, recorded beings who came from divine realm to earthly realm, who interacted with humans in ways that produced lasting effects, and whose presence preceded catastrophic flood that reset human civilization. The names beneath the names remain elusive, but the pattern the names trace is consistent. Knowledge before invention. The Mesopotamian worldview treats civilization as inheritance rather than innovation. The scribes don't describe Sumerians gradually figuring out agriculture, developing writing, experimenting with urban planning, or slowly building legal systems. They describe these things arriving completely formed from divine source. The god Enki possesses me, usually translated as divine decrees or cosmic laws, but functioning more like transferable knowledge packets or civilizational blueprints. Over 100 me are listed across various texts: kingship, priesthood, writing, music, metalwork, leatherwork, masonry, ploughing, harrowing, irrigation, temple building, divination, law, judgment, and dozens more. In the poem Inanna and the God of Wisdom, Inanna visits Enki in Eridu. Enki, pleased by her visit, begins drinking beer. As he becomes intoxicated, he offers Inanna various me. She accepts them and loads them into her boat. When Enki sobers and realizes what he's done, he tries to retrieve them, but Inanna escapes to Uruk with her cargo. The me are treated as actual transferable objects, physical or metaphysical items that contain complete knowledge of crafts and social systems. This framing is significant. Civilization isn't learned, it's received. The knowledge existed before humans possessed it. Someone had to transfer it. The Sumerian king list states the kingship descended from heaven, not humans developed kingship through social evolution. The system of governance arrived from elsewhere, already structured, already functional. Archaeological evidence complicates this claim. The development of Mesopotamian civilization can be traced gradually from Neolithic settlements around 10,000 BC through Ubaid period 65-3800 to Uruk period 4000 through 8100, when recognisable cities, writing and complex administration emerge. The process took thousands of years. It wasn't instantaneous, yet the Sumerian scribes insisted otherwise. They recorded that Eridu, the southernmost city, closest to the Persian Gulf, sacred to Enki, was the first city, built by gods before humans. That kingship descended from heaven to Eridu first, then moved to other cities as dynasties rose and fell. That the me were divine possessions granted to humanity, not human innovations. One explanation is that the Sumerians mythologized their own history, creating divine origins for practices they actually developed organically. This is standard mythological function, legitimizing present reality by giving it sacred origin. But another possibility exists. The Sumerians preserved memory of knowledge transfer that did happen, though the details were compressed, distorted, or reinterpreted over millennia of transmission. Perhaps the Apkallu tradition preserves memory of actual culture bearers, whether divine beings, survivors of an earlier civilization, or advanced human teachers, who brought systematic knowledge to Mesopotamian populations. The sudden appearance of Sumerian civilization around 3500 BCE has puzzled archaeologists. Writing, monumental architecture, complex administrative systems, sophisticated irrigation, cylinder seals, wheeled vehicles, all appear in the archaeological record within a relatively brief period, seemingly without local precedent. The Sumerian language is isolate, unrelated to surrounding Semitic languages, suggesting the Sumerians came from elsewhere, though where remains unknown. If an earlier civilization existed, perhaps destroyed by the flood documented in multiple traditions, survivors with knowledge from that civilization could have migrated to Mesopotamia and established new urban centres, teaching indigenous populations the skills and systems they remembered. Over time, these teachers would be mythologized as divine beings, their human origin forgotten or deliberately obscured, but the memory of their teaching preserved as the Apkallu tradition. This scenario requires accepting that some form of advanced pre-flood civilization existed, was destroyed, and left remnants who carried knowledge forward. It's speculative, but it fits the pattern across multiple textual traditions. Before the flood, long-lived rulers, advanced civilization, divine human proximity. After the flood, knowledge preserved by survivor Sezin passed to new generations, gradually reconstituting civilization. The Book of Enoch describes similar dynamic from negative perspective. The Watchers teach metallurgy, cosmetics, astrology, herbalism, writing and warfare, premature knowledge that humanity wasn't ready to possess. The result is corruption and violence. But notice, the knowledge is complete. The Watchers don't teach principles that humans then develop. They teach finished techniques. If knowledge came from outside humanity, either from divine beings or from pre-existing human civilization, it would appear in exactly this way, suddenly, systematically, completely. Not gradual figuring out, but complete transfer from those who already know to those who don't. The pyramid problem illustrates this dilemma globally. How did ancient Egypt develop sophisticated astronomical knowledge, precise architectural engineering, and complex mathematical systems seemingly without extended developmental period? How did megalithic cultures, Bekli Tepe 9600, Karnak 4500, Stonehenge 3000, accomplish architectural feats that required advanced understanding of geometry, astronomy and engineering? Standard archaeology explains this through human ingenuity. Smart people figured things out, even if we've lost records of their experimentation and development. This is reasonable. Humans are clever. Given time and motivation, humans invent. But the alternative can't be dismissed merely as fringe. What if some knowledge was inherited rather than invented? What if civilization has been reset more than once, with survivors carrying forward fragments of previous attainment? The Mayan Mesopotamian thought function as cosmic operating instructions. They're not learnt through experience, they're transmitted by those who already possess them. Enki has them in Eridu, Inanna takes some to Uruk. The Apkallu bring them from divine realm to human realm. The knowledge exists independent of human discovery. This maps onto the Watcher tradition. Knowledge exists in heavenly realm, prohibited from humans at their current developmental stage, but brought to earth by beings who transgress boundary protocols. The result is civilization, knowledge possession, but also corruption because the transfer was premature and the knowledge is misused. Both traditions agree knowledge came from outside, divine realm to earthly realm, those who knew to those who didn't know. The question is whether this represents mythological explanation for normal human learning, or whether it preserves memory of actual knowledge transfer from an external source. The oldest Sumerian texts we possess, from Jemdet Nasa period around 3100 BC, show writing already reasonably developed, not earliest experimental pictographs, but systematized cuneiform capable of recording complex economic transactions, religious hymns, and administrative data, as if the system arrived already functional, or as if earlier developmental stages existed but haven't been found. Similarly, the flood traditions across cultures don't describe gradual development of post-flood civilization. They describe survivors carrying knowledge forward. Noah takes animals and seeds, preserving biodiversity. Ziusudra takes the seed of all living things. Utnapishtim takes craftsmen with him on the boat, people who possess skills necessary for rebuilding. The pattern is preservation and transmission, not discovery and invention. If this pattern reflects historical reality, it means human civilization is older and has experienced more disruption than standard chronology acknowledges. It means knowledge once possessed was lost and had to be relearned or retaught. It means the Sumerians were right. They didn't invent civilization, they received it, either from divine source, from earlier human source, or from survivors who bridged the catastrophic gap between old world and new. The tablets document this philosophy consistently. Knowledge descends, it's transferred, it's granted, whether by Anunnaki, by Apkallu, by divine decree, or by righteous survivors who carry me through floodwaters. Civilization emerges from outside rather than developing from within. The archaeological evidence admits both interpretations. Gradual development can explain most of what we see, but sudden appearances, unexpected sophistication, and complete systems emerging without clear precedent allow for alternative reading. What looks like sudden invention might be preserved inheritance, memory of knowledge that existed before but had to be reconstituted after catastrophic loss. The three interpretations. When scholars approach these texts, CBS 1673, the Book of Enoch, Genesis 6, the Atrahasis Epic, the King List, they generally operate within one of three frameworks. Each framework explains the data differently, values different types of evidence, and leads to different conclusions about what actually happened. Framework 1. Mythological symbolism. This is mainstream academic consensus. The texts are ancient Near Eastern mythology, imaginative narratives created to explain origins, legitimize social structures, and provide theological meaning. The Anunnaki are literary constructs representing divine authority. The Nephilim are legendary heroes whose stories grew with retelling. The flood is either localized Mesopotamian inundation mythologized into cosmic event, or pure invention serving theological purpose. This framework values literary analysis, comparative mythology, and archaeological constraint. It asks, what social function did these stories serve? How do they reflect concerns of their composers? What earlier traditions influenced them? Evidence supporting this view: no archaeological evidence for 30,000-year reigns or 9-foot giants has been verified. Flood traditions exist globally but vary enormously in detail, suggesting independent origin or diffusion of story patterns rather than shared experience. Ancient cultures consistently mythologize their origins. This is normal human behavior, not unique to Mesopotamia or Israel. The narrative structures fit known mythological patterns: culture hero, divine council, catastrophe and renewal, sage teachers. The mythological framework allows historical kernel. Perhaps Mesopotamia experienced serious flooding that disrupted civilization, leaving memory of catastrophe. Perhaps some individuals were unusually tall or strong, becoming legendary. Perhaps cultural contact with foreigners who possessed advanced knowledge led to myths about divine teachers. But the literal details, gods breeding with humans, 900-year lifespans, 7 days of world covering water, are symbolic or exaggerated. Scholars in this framework include the entire mainstream of ancient Near Eastern studies, Assyriologists, Sumerologists, biblical scholars at major research universities. The work is careful, methodologically rigorous, and deliberately constrained to claims evidence can support. Framework 2. Encoded wisdom tradition. This framework treats the texts as containing esoteric knowledge encoded in narrative form for preservation. The Anunnaki might represent advanced humans or priestly castes who possessed specialized knowledge. The Nephilim might be elite warrior classes or royal bloodlines. The flood might be historical disaster preserved alongside philosophical teaching about human nature, divine judgment, and moral order. This approach values symbolic reading, psychological interpretation, and recognition that ancient texts often operate on multiple levels simultaneously. It asks, what deeper meanings are embedded in these stories? What psychological or spiritual truths do they preserve? How might initiates or trained priests have interpreted these narratives differently than common readers? Evidence supporting this view: 1 Nark, mystery traditions existed throughout the ancient world, preserving specialized knowledge through stories and ritual. Ancient texts frequently encode astronomical, mathematical, or calendrical data in narrative form. The consistent patterns across independent traditions suggest shared wisdom rather than coincidence. Many details make more sense symbolically than literally. For example, noise causing flood might represent disorder, moral chaos, or imbalance in cosmic harmony. Carl Jung's archetypal psychology informs some work in this framework. The Anunnaki as representations of collective unconscious archetypes, the flood as symbol of psychological transformation, the Watchers as projections of shadow material. Joseph Campbell's monomyth theory operates here, recognizing universal story patterns that speak to human experience regardless of literal historicity. Scholars and researchers in this framework include Jungian analysts, comparative religion specialists, and some theological interpreters who see sacred text as conveying transcendent truth through historical narrative without requiring literal historicity. Framework 3. Preserved historical memory. This framework treats the texts as imperfect but genuine attempts to preserve actual pre-flood history. The Anunnaki were real beings, whether advanced humans, extraterrestrial visitors, or something between, who interacted with early humanity. The Nephilim were actual hybrid offspring, possessing unusual abilities. The flood was real global or regional catastrophe that destroyed an earlier civilization, with survivors preserving memory through oral tradition that eventually was written down. This approach values textual consistency, geographic specificity, and cross-cultural corroboration. It asks, why would multiple independent cultures preserve identical narrative structures if nothing real underlies them? How did ancient people possess astronomical, mathematical, and engineering knowledge that standard chronology says they shouldn't have? What explains the sudden appearance of advanced civilization in multiple locations? Evidence supporting this view: the remarkable consistency of flood traditions globally. Over 500 cultures preserve flood narratives, many with specific details matching Genesis, Mesopotamian accounts. Genetic evidence suggests human population bottleneck approximately 70,000 years ago, consistent with near-extinction event. Megalithic structures demonstrate engineering knowledge that seems advanced for their attributed dates. The specificity of details in ancient texts, real cities, plausible geography, named individuals, suggests historical memory rather than pure invention. Researchers in this framework include alternative historians, some archaeologists working on anomalous sites, and scholars who accept catastrophist interpretations of geology and human prehistory. Their work is controversial, often dismissed by mainstream academia, but raises questions that deserve consideration even if their specific answers prove incorrect. Evaluating the frameworks. Each framework has strengths and limitations. Framework 1 is safest intellectually, requiring the least speculation beyond available evidence, but it struggles to explain the uncanny consistency across independent traditions and the sophisticated knowledge preserved in ancient texts. Framework 2 respects the depth of ancient thought while avoiding literal impossibilities, but it can become unfalsifiable. If everything is symbolic, How do we verify interpretation? How do we distinguish between genuine encoded meaning and creative overreading? Framework 3 Historical takes ancient testimony seriously and doesn't dismiss claims just because they seem impossible. But it requires accepting that current archaeological and historical consensus is significantly incomplete or wrong. It opens door to unconstrained speculation where evidence is thin. The truth may involve all three. The texts likely contain one, mythological elements that served social theological functions, encoded wisdom about human nature, moral order and cosmic structure, and 3, preserved memories of actual events distorted through millennia of transmission. The question isn't which framework is exclusively correct, but how to weight them appropriately for specific claims. Was there a catastrophic flood? Probably localized regional flooding matches both geological and textual evidence. Were there beings called Anunnaki who literally descended from heaven? Less certain could be memory of actual culture bearers mythologized over time, or pure theological construct. Did divine human hybrids produce giant offspring? Difficult to verify. No genetic or skeletal evidence supports this, but absence of evidence isn't definitive. What remains clear is that ancient civilizations across multiple continents preserve strikingly similar narratives. Beings from elsewhere came to Earth, interacted with humans, taught knowledge, produced exceptional offspring, violated cosmic boundaries, and were judged through catastrophic flood that resets civilization. Whether this reflects shared events, shared mythological templates, shared psychological archetypes, or some combination of all three remains open question. The tablets don't resolve the debate. They simply present the data. This is what we recorded. This is what happened. This is what we remember. How we interpret that data depends on which framework we bring to it, which types of evidence we value, and how willing we are to question assumptions about what was possible in the ancient world. What the silence suggests, CBS 10673 is fragmentary. Only the lower third survives. Of an estimated 260 lines, perhaps 80 are preserved. That means 180 lines, 2/3 of the original text, are gone. What did they say? We know what the preserved sections contain: creation of humans, establishment of pre-flood cities, divine protectors assigned to those cities, warning to Ziusudra, the flood lasting 7 days, emergence and sacrifice, divine forgiveness, grant of eternal life. This gives us narrative structure, setup, crisis, resolution. But what's missing? The preserved text doesn't explain why the flood was necessary. It doesn't describe what humanity did that required annihilation. It doesn't specify what corrupted the antediluvian world. The sections containing that information are precisely the sections that didn't survive. This pattern repeats across flood narratives. The Atrahasis epic has fragmentary sections exactly where motivation should be explained. The Epic of Gilgamesh, Tablet C, has Utnapishtim recount the flood story to Gilgamesh, but the justification is compressed into brief phrases about noise and divine frustration. Genesis 6 provides one verse about Nephilim before immediately transitioning to the Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become, without specifying what that wickedness consisted of. The Book of Enoch provides extensive detail: Watcher descent, forbidden teaching, giant violence, corruption of all flesh. But Enoch is preserved completely only in Ethiopian manuscripts from medieval period. The Aramaic fragments at Qumran are incomplete. The full original Book of Enoch doesn't survive. What we have is later recension, compiled from multiple sources, edited by unknown hands. The Book of Giants from Qumran is fragmentary to the point of barely readable. The manuscript preserves portions from caves 1, 2, 4 and 6, but the best preserved fragments, 4Q203, 4Q 530, 532, still have massive gaps. We know it described giant offspring named Ohia and Hahia. We know they sent Mahaway to consult Enoch. We know they feared coming judgment. But the complete narrative? Lost. The Dead Sea Scrolls as a whole represent fraction of what was written. Approximately 900 manuscripts were found in the Qumran caves. Most are fragmentary, many are identified by tiny scraps, a few words, a partial line. The complete library those fragments represent? Gone, decomposed, destroyed. The Library of Alexandria, founded around 283 BC, contained an estimated 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls, the accumulated knowledge of the ancient world. It burned multiple times Julius Caesar's visit in 48 BCE, Aurelian's destruction in 270 C, Theophilus's decree in 391 C. What was lost? Thousands of books on mathematics, astronomy, engineering, history, philosophy, medicine. Early copies of texts we now have only in late medieval manuscripts. Works mentioned by ancient authors but never found. Entire genres of literature erased. The question is, what those lost texts might have contained. If complete copies of Mesopotamian traditions existed in Alexandria, what details did they preserve that CBS 10673 lacks? If early Jewish texts fully explaining Genesis 6 existed, what did they say? If alternative flood narratives from other cultures were collected and compared, what patterns would emerge? The silence in the surviving texts might not be accident. Some scholars suggest deliberate editing. Later scribes uncomfortable with divine-human mixing removed or obscured those details. Others suggest the details were never written down because they were oral tradition everyone knew. No need to spell out what your audience already understands. But there's another possibility. The information was written, was preserved for centuries, and then was lost through the normal processes of time. Manuscripts decaying, libraries burning, texts not being copied because they became religiously uncomfortable or politically problematic. Early Christian church fathers debated which texts should be canonical. The Book of Enoch was widely read and quoted in early Christianity. It's explicitly cited in Jude 14:15. Yet by the 4th century, it was excluded from the biblical canon except in Ethiopian Orthodox tradition. Why? Possibly because its elaborate angelology and detailed description of divine-human mixing didn't fit developing theological frameworks. Similar selection happened in Jewish tradition. The Talmud mentions texts that existed but were hidden away, removed from public circulation, not destroyed, but not promoted. The Book of Giants was known to Rabbinic Judaism, but not included in the Masoretic canon. The Qumran community preserved it, but Qumran was destroyed by the Romans in 68 C, and its library wasn't rediscovered until 1947. What would our understanding be if we had complete versions? If CBS 10673 existed intact with all 260 lines? If the Book of Giants survived whole? If multiple independent flood narratives could be compared in detail? The current evidence is like trying to understand a novel when you have chapters 1, 7 and 12, but chapters 2, 6 and 8, 11 are missing. You can reconstruct general plot, but the mechanisms, motivations and crucial details are gone. You know something happened between chapter 1 and chapter 7, but exactly what is inference? The gaps become significant when considering controversial claims. Did divine beings literally breed with humans? The texts that would describe this in detail are exactly the texts that don't fully survive or weren't preserved. Were the Nephilim actual giants or legendary warriors? The texts that might clarify are fragmentary or lost. What specific knowledge did the Watchers/Apkallu teach? Lists exist, but detailed descriptions of how it was taught and why it was problematic missing. The pattern suggests selective preservation, whether deliberate or accidental. The texts that survived are those that could be interpreted safely, that fit into established religious frameworks, that didn't challenge too many orthodoxies. The texts that contained uncomfortable details, perhaps too explicit about divine-human interaction, perhaps too clear about knowledge that was supposed to be forgotten, those texts are the ones that didn't make it. Or perhaps that's reading too much into random destruction. Manuscripts decay, libraries burn, conquering armies destroy records. The texts that survived might be simply the text that happened to be in the right place at the right time, in dry caves rather than humid temples, in conquered but not burned cities, copied repeatedly because they were liturgically useful even if controversial. But the silence speaks. The gaps appear in precisely the places where we most want information. The questions we have are exactly the questions the lost portions might have answered, and we're left with fragments, implications, edges of a larger story, mostly erased by time. The tablets we possess document the structure. Something happened. It involved divine beings. It produced unusual offspring. It led to judgment and flood. The tablets we don't possess might have explained the details, exactly what happened, precisely how it worked, why it was wrong, what was lost, and what implications it carried for understanding human origins and purpose. In the absence of complete texts, interpretation fills the gaps. Different frameworks supply different answers, but the honest response to the silence is acknowledgement. We don't know. We have portions. We have fragments. We have clues. But the full story, if it was ever fully written, hasn't survived. What remains are clay tablets in museums, carbon dated to centuries BC, preserving narratives about a world before this world, beings before these beings, and catastrophe that separated then from now. The rest is silence. The question the tablets ask. It's late now, wherever you are, whatever time you started this, the night has deepened. The script has followed the evidence through 12 cities, across 4 languages, spanning 3 millennia of testimony. Time to rest. Time to let the information settle. CBS 10673 sits in its climate control case in Philadelphia, 13 centimetres long, 10 centimetres wide, less than 2 centimetres thick. A fragment of baked clay impressed with wedge-shaped marks 3,700 years ago by someone who was not there when the events occurred, but who faithfully transmitted the stories they inherited. The tablet weighs perhaps 200 grams, less than half a pound, but the weight of its claims is considerably heavier. What it asks is not whether you believe. Belief isn't required. What it asks is whether you'll consider the possibility that the ancient world operated under different rules than you've been told, that beings the texts call gods might have been something real, that the flood wasn't metaphor, that the boundaries between divine and human were once more permeable than they've since become. The question isn't whether the Anunnaki were aliens. Nothing in the Sumerian texts suggests extraterrestrial origin. They're described as divine, not foreign. The question is whether divine meant something different than we assume, whether those the ancient texts called gods were actual beings who actually interacted with actual humans in the actual world, or whether all of it is imaginative construction serving psychological, social and theological functions. The question isn't whether Nephilim were 10 feet tall. The question is whether divine-human mixing occurred, producing offspring who possessed capabilities that normal humans lacked, and whether that mixing violated cosmic law in ways that required reset. The question isn't whether the flood covered Everest. The question is whether catastrophic regional inundation destroyed the Mesopotamian civilization of the antediluvian period, preserving memory of world before this world that later cultures continue to reference. The tablets don't provide certainty, they provide testimony, multiple witnesses, independent traditions, consistent narrative structure, geographic specificity, temporal correlation. The testimony doesn't prove the events happened as described, but it establishes that multiple cultures believe they happened and carefully preserve the accounts. And the pattern beneath the testimony is haunting. Beings came, taught, mixed, transgressed, boundaries blurred, order collapsed, judgment came as water, one survived, everything reset, the old world ended. The new world began different, diminished, separated from whatever proximity to the divine had characterized the first age. Whether this represents actual history, preserved memory of catastrophic but natural events mythologized over time, or sophisticated symbolic narrative encoding philosophical truths, each reader determines based on their own framework, their own evidence evaluation, their own willingness to question consensus. What's not in question is that the ancients took this seriously. The Sumerian scribes who compiled the king list weren't joking about 30,000-year reigns. They recorded them with same careful precision they used for historically verified kings. The Hebrew scribes who included Genesis 6:1-4 weren't adding filler. Those 4 verses are among the most debated in biblical scholarship. The Enochian tradents who preserved the Watcher story weren't fantasizing. They treated it as a central explanation for why the world is as it is. The ancients believed this was their history. They believed beings called by various names, Anunnaki, Apkallu, Watchers, Sons of God, were real entities who shaped human development. They believed these beings violated proper boundaries, producing consequences that culminated in divine judgment. They believed humanity, as we know it, emerged from catastrophic reset, carrying forward fragments of knowledge from the lost world. Perhaps they were simply wrong. Perhaps they invented elaborate myths to explain things they didn't understand. Perhaps divine-human mixing is impossible, 1,000-year lifespans are physiologically nonsensical, and global floods are geologically implausible. Or perhaps the ancient testimony, preserved across multiple civilizations at great effort and expense, contains more truth than modern presumption allows. The tablets don't demand belief, they simply present evidence and ask, what if? What if the Sumerians accurately recorded who ruled before the flood? What if Genesis 6 preserves actual events, not allegory? What if the Anunnaki and Nephilim were different names for the same phenomenon documented by cultures who hadn't yet learned to compare notes? What if civilization is older than we think? What if catastrophic reset erased earlier attainment? What if we're not the first time humanity has reached this level of development? What if the beings our ancestors called gods were real, not omnipotent, not omniscient, not moral paragons, but real entities with real power who really interacted with humanity in ways that shaped history? The question isn't comfortable. It requires considering that materialist assumption might be incomplete, that the ancient worldview might contain information we've discarded too quickly, that the gap between primitive superstition and modern science might be bridged by recognizing that sometimes primitive testimony preserves actual observations described in the vocabulary available to observers. CBS 1673 doesn't answer these questions. It simply asks them in cuneiform pressed into clay before Abraham left Ur, before Moses led the Exodus, before David conquered Jerusalem. The questions are older than Judaism, older than any modern religion, older than the categories we use to interpret them. And the questions remain: who were the Anunnaki? What were the Nephilim? What happened before the flood that multiple cultures felt compelled to preserve in their most sacred texts? And why does the memory refuse to fade? Sleep now. Let the questions work in the deeper layers of consciousness, where reason relaxes and pattern recognition operates freely. The tablets have presented their testimony. The witnesses have spoken across millennia. The evidence sits in museums, available for examination by anyone willing to look. Whether you decide they describe mythology, wisdom tradition, or preserved history, the fact remains someone thought this was important enough to write down, copy, preserve, and transmit through 4,000 years of war, conquest, empire collapse, and cultural transformation. Perhaps that preservation itself is the answer. Perhaps the question isn't whether the Anunnaki were real, but why their memory endures. Perhaps the question isn't whether the Nephilim existed, but why their story keeps being told. Perhaps the question isn't whether the flood happened, but why nearly every culture on Earth preserves the same warning: there was a world before. It was destroyed. We survived. Remember. The tablets ask the question, you provide the answer. Or perhaps you simply sit with the question, allowing mystery to remain mystery, acknowledging that the ancient world contain depths we've barely begun to fathom. Rest well. The questions will still be there when you wake.